We made this.
Hello and welcome back everyone to Blair Witch Minute, a podcast looking at 1999's seminal found footage horror movie The Blair Witch Project 1 minute at a time. I'm your host, Tony Black, and this minute begins at 4 minutes precisely as we see Heather continuing to introduce Burkittsville and ends on 4 minutes 59 seconds with the old man starting to tell the story of Rustin Parr. So, yeah, we got one more minute with my guest, in this case, for this block, before we switch over. It's Mike Jozic. Mike, it's been great to have you on this opening journey with me. I hope you've enjoyed it so far.
It has been a pleasure. I hope I haven't dragged some of these on longer than you need them to be.
Not at all. Not at all. I think your contribution's been brilliant. I think we've had some fantastic discussions. And we kind of discussed some of this minute, actually, in the previous one to an extent, because there is quite an overlap in how, you know, in discussing the whole scene of how Heather puts together this film. And, you know, we talked a fair bit about her, you know, earnestness and seriousness in the last minute. So we won't go over all of that necessarily. But I think it's definitely an introduction, because this takes probably around half of the minute where Heather's film, you know, the cemetery, is being shot. And it gives you it gives you another little dose, I think, of aspects of the mythology. So we know that Burkittsville was founded in 1824 on the site of another town called Blair. We know that it's a small little town. We know that there are only a certain amount of families who were buried in the area, but there's a lot of children buried. And one interesting thing she says is that no one in the town remembers anything unusual from all these children dying in the 40s. But then that's not true, because the old man who then speaks towards the end does seem to know the legend. So it's interesting how she says that. Is it an example again of how she hasn't really done her research?
I think that's a really good reading of it.
Because then she's filming this, but they're still then going off and talking to people in the town. It's like then she's doing research around this. So, you know, in the final product, would she have got rid of that line, I wonder? You know, she'd have edited that out because they've actually spoken to Burkittsville residents who say, actually,
you know,
this is what happened.
To be fair, in her research, I mean, the townspeople may not have done a lot of talking to press. There may not be a lot of documentation or, you know, oral history around these events. So she may have done her research and she just may not have uncovered a lot. I mean, I know, you know, in my line of podcasting, there are things that are considered sort of canonical history that when you do a little bit of digging, you find out, oh, that's not exactly the way it happened. You know, like there's more to the story. And so she may have gotten, you know, the party line in whatever book she was reading. And we don't know how many books she was reading or how many books there actually are about any of these things. And when she does hit the town, these people are all like, oh, yeah, I totally know what you're talking about and, you know, have stories about it. So I do think you're probably correct that she probably would have gone back and, you know, maybe overdubbed or re-recorded that introduction. That's one of those things that I think this movie sort of wrestles with in a way, because that's the material they have. And it's also that art imitating life, too, because that's the material that Myrick and Sanchez had. So it has to go in the film, and that's the material that they had prior to disappearing, so they never did complete the film. So it's kind of this snake eating its own tail kind of thing, and that's why it's there. So you could criticize it or you know, challenge it and be like, oh, well, you know, Heather doesn't know her stuff or it's wrong or whatever. But I don't know, it's all kind of, it's wearing its process on its sleeve, I guess, and maybe on a first viewing, I think on the first viewing you're basically, you're feeling that anticipation and you're waiting for things to happen, and as the movie goes on, you know, it scares you, it doesn't scare you, you know, whatever reaction you have to it, but it's only on subsequent viewings, because you're not necessarily just looking for the scary bits, you're looking for the bits between the bits. The space between spaces, to quote John Hurt from Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. But
wow, that is a deep cut quote there, Mike.
Yeah, it's one of the warts and all kind of things that I like about it, and it's the sort of thing that I would maybe challenge it on a first viewing, but would be more accepting of it moving on.
Yeah, I to be fair, it's only really that I'm thinking about it and I'm looking into it. It's never struck me as a problem in that sense. It's just interesting to think about Heather's process and think about how, you know, it wouldn't stand out to me as much if they didn't then immediately pretty much cut to sequences of people remembering the legend and then that old man has quite a level of detail. It's interesting because he says. Well, he talks more about it in the next few minutes, so I won't go too deeply into it. But when they ask him about the Blair Witch, he says, "Oh, that's an old story." But he's talking about the 40 stuff, and it's like, well, that's not that old. This guy's probably around 60, so he would have been a young kid, maybe a little bit older than 60. So he would have, in theory, been a little boy when the Rustin Parr murders happened. And the children disappeared and things like that. So he might remember something going on at the time, but that's been passed down to him. That information has definitely passed down to him, and he's found that out through time, and he's retained it. I just don't know. I just find it very interesting that the film does this. The film, on the one hand, has these oral history recollections of events that happened as part of the Blair Witch mythos, but on the other, it doesn't seem to be stuff that Heather's been able to find out until she's gone there. I don't know, and I just think that's really interesting, that it's almost like it's a legend that has purposely been underreported or just forgotten, or I don't know why that fascinates me so much, but it does. I just really I think that's one of the things I love the most about it. In fact, these scenes, I think, Mike, I love among the most in the film, actually.
I agree.
The mythology being laid out without the context, and then the context comes when they're in the woods. In some sense,
I think that's why we enjoy The Curse of the Blair Witch as much as we do, because it's similar to this. Like, it's the revealing of, you know, it's peeling the layers of the story and revealing the horrors that happened in that area. And it's funny because now I'm fascinated by this as you're explaining it. You know, everything from, you mentioned cutting immediately to the people who are basically contradicting Heather, and I'm like, is this the same police guy who edited the artful graveyard scenes now, like undermining Heather? Or or again, it could just be, maybe this is local history, right? Like, maybe this is not something that really makes its way out of the town, and she only discovers it when she arrives in the town. I do find her process incredibly frustrating as somebody who does interviewing himself. She's constantly talking over people. She interrupts them. She leads them.
Yeah.
She's always like,
yeah, it's true.
She's reacting to them in ways, you know, like saying yeah and mm-hmm. And I remember the last time I watched this movie for my podcast, I just turned to my co-host roommate and I was like, I want to punch her. I want to punch her in the face.
Do you think it's that she doesn't? Well, I suppose it's, again, that youthful thing, that inexperience. But is it also, do you think, that she thinks she knows everything? That's the other thing. Sometimes I feel like that she feels like she's got a grasp on it all.
It could be,
and that it's all about presenting it. But then the reality is that she's not listening well enough to these people. I
really like that phrasing.
In a way, you know,
she's not listening.
I don't know. She's not. I don't know.
She's hearing, but she's not listening. Wonder.
She's hearing, but she's not listening. Yeah, you know, and that she's not. You know, I always think about the again, going back to The Curse of the Blair Witch. There's a character in that called I think her name's Dottie Fulcher or something like that, and she's like a local woman who knows the legend of it and all that. And there's one thing she says in that always strikes me, where she says, "I think they knew about the legend, but they didn't respect Ellie Kedwood, the witch. They didn't respect it enough to actually, you know, realised that they were putting themselves in danger. And then she says something like, I think they went there and she met them and they're gone, basically. And it's that whole idea that in this woman's mind, the fact they don't listen to the local stories and the local people who are telling them really weird, scary things and warning them, like we talked about in that other minute, about the woman who says, I don't go up there, you know, but they still do. Heather doesn't think anything's going to happen. She just thinks she's going to get this cool documentary about this strange legend and that she's going to come home Odysseus-like successful, you know, on her quest. I just think that's really interesting. I think these scenes are all establishing that in her, really.
Hindsight is 20/20, but it might have been good to have a scene of maybe Mike, because Mike, he is that rogue element, you know, if just saying, I don't know if I want to go up there, guys. Yeah. And having them be like, you know, don't be such a wuss. Like,
is Mike the first guy who basically says they should go? Because that's now you've said that. I don't know if it's Mike who's the first one who basically turns around and says, "Let's just go. Let's just get out of here." Or it might be Josh.
It could be. I do remember Josh being really sensitive about time and wanting to get back in time to get the camera back so that it's not discovered that he's taken it. But I don't remember if Mike starts whining about it before Josh starts whining about it. But Heather is definitely the one, whoever it is, Heather is definitely the one who's like pushing them forward and saying like, no, let's just keep going.
Yeah. Yeah. But I think you're right. Having a scene like that would have been interesting, where somebody says, should we go? Like, this is all weird. I mean, if I was hearing all this and I was finding out some of this for the first time, I'd be like, I don't know, guys. I don't know if I want to go here. Like, it's... but then, presumably, these guys presumably don't hold any stock in knowledge about myths and legends. I mean, it's funny because I'm not a religious man, Mike. I'm not somebody who is into as much as I have an X-Files podcast, I'm not obsessed with conspiracies and real. But I've always been fascinated and spooked out by the supernatural, paranormal, myths, legends. And I do think if there was somewhere near me where people vanished and they disappeared off the face of the earth or had died, I don't think I'd go. I don't think I would do it still. I would err on the side of caution. And I would say, there might all be a reasonable explanation, but why put yourself in that situation? But these guys never think like that. And I think that's really interesting. They have such a reckless confidence about what they're doing, that they don't think about maybe it's true. What if it's true?
I also really appreciate the fact that the stories that they're getting, it's not like the same story per se. Like, everybody sort of has a slightly different take on it, or it's not super consistent where it feels like somebody gave them, the Bible of the Blair Witch, mythology. And it's like, here's where we're going to get rid of a lot of exposition. Like, there's a real naturalism to it. And I've used, the word verisimilitude before. Like, it helps perpetuate the reality. You have the one, Ed's sister saying she's heard of it. She thinks her sister goes to the school. And then you have the older people with the different types of stories. And I really, really like the inconsistency of it. I think the first time I watched it, it felt like too many things at once, where I was like, there is no consistent mythology. But on further viewings, like, for me, that just makes it even better.
I agree. I think it's piecing that together. It's the fun of the audience member being able to piece it together. And then, certainly after the fact, particularly wonder. Because when you're in the middle of it, as we've said, that doesn't really happen. You're more just, you've got the information in the back of your head, and then what the old man goes on and says in the next minute explains the ending, essentially.
Yeah.
And that's key. So that, that will, if you remember that conversation, you'll have some context for what happens at the very end. But it's only when you go back and watch it and think about this stuff then you start to piece together all these aspects of mythology. So it's great. It is great. It is that uncertainty and that's the reality of an oral history of an urban myth. It would be piecemeal. It would be different people with different stories, some of which are true, some of which are not, some of which are embellished. And that's the great thing about this, in that they walk into the situation and the film does a great job through visuals, through establishing characters, through oral history, of piecing together a mythology that allows you to understand potentially what they experience.
And it feeds them.
And that's more skilled than you give it credit. People give it credit for, I think.
And it feeds the mystery and the curiosity because you don't get the full story. There's still questions. So the investigation sort of still needs to continue. You know, the characters aren't just like, oh, okay, that's the full story. Let's get a few more shots of the town and go home.
Absolutely, yeah. It's as is great about this film, lots is left open-ended. But yeah, in the minutes to come, we'll get a little bit more into what actually the old man says and a little bit more of this mythology. But I'll be joined by a new guest for that little block of minutes. But Mike, it's been fantastic to talk to you and have you open this podcast with me and do these opening minutes. I think it's been a terrific conversation, and I really look forward to having you back on the show down the line at some point. So thank you so much.
I'm thrilled to have been here to help start this journey out into the woods, and I look forward to coming back and kind of wrapping up what we started here.
Yeah, I think that's going to be the plan, that you're going to come back right towards the very end and, come back when it's really all kicking off towards the end. So that'll be good. Land you in the middle of that. So that'll be great. Until then, I think it's the right thing to do is to point people towards where they can listen to you in other of your endeavours. You know, I talked earlier about your film and your Scooby-Doo podcast in previous minutes. So why don't you tell people a little bit about what they are and also where they can find them?
Well, my film podcast is called For Your Consideration, also abbreviated to FYC Show. And essentially it's myself and my co-host Dustin Friesenhan, and we are going through the list of the 2012 Sight and Sound films, which are voted by directors and critics as their favorite films or the greatest films of all time. We watch them, we evaluate them, and we decide whether we think they truly are, masterpieces of cinema or museum pieces, cultural artifacts, things that aren't necessarily good films, but or not necessarily the best films of all time, but they definitely hold a place, in history. Definitely something that should be seen. They're classics. They should be studied. That sort of thing. We catch a lot of heat for some of our decisions on this. But that's a conversation regardless, so that's great. And the other podcast I do is a Scooby-Doo podcast. It's called A Podcast Named Scooby-Doo. And kind of my logline there is I'm unraveling the mystery of history. Basically, it's a 50-year franchise that not a lot of kind of archival work has been done, interviewing people who have worked in various facets of the franchise, people who've worked on comic books, television shows, movies, music, like kind of the whole schmear. Anybody who's touched the franchise, I'm willing to sit down and talk to, and that's actually, it's been a lot of fun, taking us to some interesting places. And For Your Consideration can be found at fycshow.libsyn.com, at FYC Show on Twitter, and we're also on YouTube. Just search For Your Consideration, I guess. There's the Facebook page, all the social media stuff. And podcast name Scooby-Doo is www.scoobydoocast.com, and at Scooby-Doo for Twitter. Same deal with the social media. It's on Facebook, Instagram. There's WordPress blog, but if you're interested and you go to look for it, you'll eventually find all those other things. So
fantastic. I look forward to listening to them both, actually, and I think the Scooby-Doo project is particularly brilliant in that it's providing a real history, an oral history, since we've been talking about it, about that hugely famous and beloved series franchise. Even it's fantastic what you're doing there. So yeah, I hope people check it out.
Another fun thing that we do on the podcast is, because Warner Brothers doesn't really support their home video or digital releases for Scooby-Doo product with any kind of real added value content, anytime I interview somebody, I always offer the opportunity to record an audio commentary. So writers and directors, I think I've got 6 or 8 of them right now that I've released.
That's brilliant.
And it gives an opportunity, a little extra behind the scenes kind of look. People who own the DVDs or own them digitally, can now... I'm a special features whore. I mean, we've talked about the Blair Witch commentary repeatedly over the course of these minutes, and that's always something I turn to. And I was once told, if it doesn't exist, create it. So until Warner Brothers tells me to stop.
Well, if they've got any brains, they won't tell you to stop, because it's fantastic. It's a fantastic resource. It will be, an important one, really, that you're doing. So that's fantastic, and I equally can't wait to get stuck into your film podcast as well, because it is enormously up my alley. So yeah, I will absolutely be listening to those projects. So that's fantastic. But yeah, you'll be back at some point later, towards the end, as we say, Mike. So it'll be great to have you back on then, much further down the line.
If I haven't disappeared from now to then. Mysteriously.
You haven't vanished off the face of the earth. Yeah, well, if we can find you, we'll have you back, definitely. Yeah, if you're looking for me, guys, as well, just check out my Twitter at AJBlackWriter, where you can find all the different things I'm doing. But more importantly, check out at Blair Witch Min on Twitter, which is where our Twitter page, Twitter focus will be for the podcast, and also our podcast network. We made this at We Made This Pod at WeMadeThisPod.com. So check out all the other things we're doing. We'll give you a little sneak peek, as always, as to what's on the network in a minute. But thanks again, Mike, and thank you guys for listening to Blair Witch Minute, and we'll be back for a whole new minute very soon. But until then, stay out of the woods.
It's good advice.
It is. It's not bad advice, is it? Elsewhere on We Made This. Observing the Pattern, a Fringe podcast.
You'd have a doctor saying, oh, well, it's because, if someone's come back from the dead, it's because they were frozen and their body temperature warmed up, or, they ingested this poison that, made it look like death, or whatever it was, rather than it being a miracle that's seen as the more outlandish thing. So it's quite interesting seeing the roles reversed here. Because I know our sympathies lie with Walter, but then equally, I felt kind of sorry for the priest, who's just like, right, you realise this is mad, right?
Yeah.
There's no part of this that is safe.
Life's milestones.
Sleepwalkers. Took him to see that.
That Stephen King thing with the evil cat people.
About the incestuous cat people, yeah.
Goodness sake.
And also Natural Born Killers was another one I went to see with my dad.
How old were you?
Well, he used to sneak me in. I was about 14. Yeah, so he'd go and buy the tickets, and I'd go and get the popcorn, and he'd be like, right, let's go. Bearing in mind, my dad at the time was the detective sergeant of the West Midlands Drug Squad.
The Time Is Now, a Millennium podcast.
Yeah, I think when we get to Skull and Bones, the final scene in that one where he gives his reasons to Emma, I think that has been criticised quite much. But then obviously we'll look at Peter Watts over the course of the season.
But that's perfect. That's perfect.
Yeah.
Because how many times that's what people in his position say.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, you hate me and you think I'm doing bad, but when the food runs out, who are you going to blame? That goes back to 3 Days of the Condor, right?
Yeah.
Check out all of these shows and more on the We Made This podcast network.